these relations aren't necessarily determining. There are possibilities for pushing back. Yeah, so as Alison mentioned, this is some quite an old topic of mine. I'm doing some other things at the moment, but I've just been thinking about it recently in light of the COVID-19 crisis, given that there are so many ways and that there are overlaps with the kind of things that I was working on then. So specifically, as these slides show, I'm going to talk about debt and debt collection, and then thinking about how that might relate to the current moment in relation to the COVID-19 crisis. And I'm going to be thinking about how it might be intersecting with what I call the amplification of uncertainty that is very characteristic of the debt collection industry and of processes of debt collection. This image on the first slide is from a video produced by a not-for-profit organisation called Step Change, which is probably the largest debt advice organisation in the UK, so providing advice to people who are struggling with their debts. And a lot of my work and a lot of their work focuses specifically on those who are struggling with unsecured debts. So these are things like credit card debts or payday loan debts or car loan debts, or those are partly secured anyway, and things like personal loans. So this video features debt advisors who work for Step Change and talking about the services that Step Change offers. And when I talk about the amplification of uncertainty, what I'm going to be talking about is not just about how this crisis increases uncertainty, although, as we've heard from both Monica and Ala, it certainly does, and I'm sure this also applies to you, but actually how uncertainty is both a feature of living with debt, and specifically it's a feature of living with debt that those looking to collect debt look to exploit and to intensify, to render more intensive. And this is at a moment where, according to Step Change themselves, they are busier than they have been at any time in their 27-year history. If you look at the Twitter stream, it's quite interesting to see that one of the first replies to their Twitter post is from a debtor. And I'll just read you out that tweet. I'm one of your clients. I've been harassed by Milton Keynes Council Tax Debt Collection, who are called Bristow and Suter. Ignoring my mental illness, anxiety and depression, living with a chronic blood condition, COVID-19 will kill me, won't acknowledge my payment plan, help me please. And to me, this is a really vivid illustration of how this crisis, in which some bodies are more vulnerable than others, overlaps in quite particular ways with the experience of living with unmanageable debt. As many debtors have told me over many years, and in very similar terms to this Twitter poster, the prompts of debt collectors can feel highly intrusive and can be especially stressful for those with certain mental health needs. And I think it's important to kind of keep this in mind in relation to some of the reporting we're seeing around debt here in the UK at the moment. So there are a number of sort of schemes that have been created to deal with some of these issues. So, for example, UK lenders have been pressured or compelled into granting payment holidays. So, as per this headline, having granted nearly £1.2 million payment holidays to different debtors, which is, of course, welcome. But what I would say is it doesn't necessarily resolve this problem, this central problem of uncertainty. In actual fact, it probably just pushes this question of uncertainty more into the future and does some of that work of rendering uncertainty even more intensive. So some of the things that I've looked at in relation to these kind of issues are how specific techniques and technologies used in the credit industry work in relation to uncertainty. And one of the kind of classic ones would be a debt collection letter, which includes all kinds of different prompts, which on the one hand kind of are designed to make the debtor think that something may be happening. Maybe about to happen. So, for instance, this first letter references things like getting a potential county court judgment or bailiffs visiting the property or potentially damage being inflicted on an individual's credit file, with the call to action that if they don't want these things to happen, they should make a payment right now. But of course, the debtor doesn't quite know whether these things will happen or not. And so in some senses, and actually the creditor themselves may not know at this point whether they actually are going to follow through with what they're threatening. So there is this kind of uncertainty that on the one hand is being attempted to be sort of managed by this letter, but on the other hand is also being exploited. Here are just some other examples from Metropolitan Debt Collection Services: urgent communication, do not ignore. Important, read this carefully, serving of a default notice, so introducing some sort of legalistic language. Doorstep collection notice, threatening the potential incursion into the home of a doorstep debt collector. A more kind of I guess kind of inviting prompt, asking the debtor to make them an offer, demanding immediate action, potentially proposing litigation, and the more kind of classic example of issuing a final notice. And you can talk a lot about the design of these letters and so on, and I've done some of that kind of stuff as well. But one of the things that I was really interested to do was actually look at how some of these techniques emerged historically. If you look, and I became really fascinated with the US debt collection industry, because many of the techniques that have now become the norm in both the UK and in many other countries can find their origin in the US. And here we see some of the kind of logics emerging that would come to characterize debt collection work in the present moment, and certainly will be the logics that will be informing contemporary debt collection activity in relation to the to debtors who are struggling as a result of perhaps losing their jobs or being affected in some other way by the COVID-19 crisis. This is an article about a letter series. So debt collectors often create these letter series where they plan a series of different letters, one after the other, and nowadays combining that with things like text messages, emails, a variety of different other media, to try and reclaim as much as they can. In this letter series, they specifically are interested in this question of uncertainty, which is here and framed around anxiety. So using the anxiety that debtors have, and thinking about ways to potentially profit from that. And what this particular debt collection company wanted, as is written here, is to create a system of demands. The owner of this company, R.H. Carter, writes, a system of demands that would be psychologically effective, something that would, through a psychological effect on the average mind, automatically create a maximum average money reaction. And he carries on, the effect they were looking for can be described as, quote, making the debtor feel as though he, using the gendered language that was the norm at the time, he was standing on a railroad track with an express train on its way. In the beginning, he sees or feels only a hint of a shape on the horizon, and is disturbed by only the faintest sound. From this beginning, the whole disaster builds from a vague, shadowy outline, relentlessly coming closer and closer, faster and faster, until in the final minute, the debtor sees the full power and form of the disaster bearing down on him. So again, sort of combining this anxiety that a debtor feels with this sense of inevitability. If they really want to resolve this uncertainty, they should act in the present. So what kind of sociological questions does this raise? Well, many. Here are some, and these are in relation to the present moment. So, are the effects of the COVID-19 crisis evenly distributed? If not, how are they distributed? Why is it like this? What role do different bodies, different life experiences, different domestic settings play in how debtors are dealing with debt in the present moment? And I think you can reframe this in a different way. So what are these social and organizational forces that are shaping the economic decisions that we're making? One of the things I think is interesting to think, if you're thinking about doing a degree in sociology, is think about how are the questions that a sociologist might ask different from some of the questions that, say, a psychologist or an economist might ask. I'm an economic sociologist, at least in part of my sociological life, and the questions I ask are related to the kind of questions that, say, a behavioural psychologist might ask or an economist, but they're different. So thinking about some of the context of the economic decisions that we're making might be interesting and helpful. And how can we as social scientists argue and perhaps also practice a more just and equitable world, overlapping very much with the kind of things that both Monica and Alla were talking about. And of course, as sociologists, we use methods, and Monica's already talked about them, and so has Alla, really interesting methods. Here are some methods that I have used to answer some of these questions. So doing interviews, interviewing debtors, using statistics, obviously. So when you're thinking about how debt is distributed in a particular, let's say, national context, statistics are incredibly important. Archival research, organizational ethnography. So I went into debt collection agencies and observed the work of debt collectors and spoke to those working in that industry to try and understand their work in more depth. Online ethnography, using online materials and spending time hanging out in online spaces to try and understand how people are using the potentials of a range of different online infrastructures. And some of these go together in my book that was published a few years ago now. But I think one of the things that doing a degree in sociology will do, and I think hopefully doing a degree in sociology at Lancaster, will introduce you to some of these methods and also some of the much more kind of experimental methods that Monica and Ala were talking about, and potentially also about how to combine them. Okay, I think that's me done. Back to you, Alison.
Great, thank you so much, Joe. And that was really interesting to see. I think you might be able to add to some of what Monica was saying before, but I'd also just be really interested to hear your thoughts on some of the sort of examples of care that we've seen in like private settings. So things like private renters or private landlords, pardon me, offering people rent forgiveness for a few or a window in light of the crisis. And, you know, it seems like there are, in these individual, more one-to-one relationships, have been some opportunities for care around what would otherwise be seen as like debt needing to be managed. But I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts on those kinds of instances and how it relates to that broader culture and process that you were talking about.
That's really interesting, Alison. There's probably a research project in there actually somewhere. I mean, I think you're right. I think one of the things that, I mean, it'd be interesting to see kind of how that manifests itself over a large scale, right? So we hear about some of these kind of anecdotal cases of landlords being a bit more lenient, perhaps, but of course, much of the housing stock is owned by these large corporations, and one suspects they probably aren't quite so lenient necessarily. But I think it'd be really interesting to think about, and it's interesting to think about what debt means when it is kind of more bilateral, when it's between two people. And there, perhaps the kind of the human side of what actually a debt obligation implies comes to the fore, because a debt obligation is a bond. It's a bond that ties two people or a person and an organization together. And there are many different dimensions to that bond. There's a legal dimension, and certainly in theory, potentially a landlord could enforce that legal obligation once the kind of special dispensations that are existing currently during the COVID-19 crisis recede. So, for example, right now, I believe renters aren't allowed to be, or that can't be evicted from the properties due to non-payment, but that will pass. So in theory, that legal bond remains there. But with debt, there's always other bonds. And actually, about debt collectors have to exploit those bonds, actually. The legal connection that binds a debtor to their debt isn't actually strong enough for debt collectors to rely on that alone. And that's the very reason they use all these different techniques, because in actual fact, this bond is very fragile. It's expensive to take people through the courts. And it's much cheaper actually to make them feel bad about their debts and make them or feel threatened, to make the debt resonate in some other way with their lives. Yes, and those kind of more positive examples, you see the kind of other face of these bonds. That yes, you know, there you have a kind of perhaps a feeling of guilt on the part of the landlord, that they feel that they don't really want to kind of at this precise moment be sort of enforcing the full legal dimension of that debt bond. In relation to Monica, I was just thinking when you were talking, Monica, just about, you know, there are many, I mean, there are many ways in which, you know, the life of precarity can be seen to manifest itself in relation to debt. I think one of the most common ways is you see the debt, which is on the face of it, again, in the kind of the way it's legally framed as this very one-to-one relationship between the debtor and the creditor. But what you see in this kind of life of precarity is the debt tends to kind of spread and kind of spread across a household. Children start talking about the debt because they see their mother or their father worrying about letters that are coming through the door, or phone calls that are coming into their on their mobile phone, or whatever it might be, or a text message. And you have this phenomenon of debt kind of becoming this persona in a household, and the household relations becoming organized around this debt. So the debt really becomes this highly intrusive figure in household, and that's, I think, one of the things that life is very common in this life of precarity. But also very similar to what Monica was talking about, you have this kind of phenomenon of debtors organising and doing different media to do so. So one of the things I did was study the ways that debtors are coming together to resist debt collectors on online forums and discussing strategies to resist and to deal with some of these letters and prompts that are coming through their doors. So I think, yeah, it's interesting to always hold in mind that, you know, these relations aren't necessarily determining. There are possibilities for pushing back, and I think as sociologists, it's really important to highlight those when they exist, to move beyond some of those quite simplistic narratives that you often find in the mass media and so on. I think part of what being a sociologist is about is actually that thinking, can we develop a really nuanced, precise argument about what is happening here? And hopefully that's one of the things that we're training people to do.